Good morning or good afternoon, depending on where you are. Welcome to the CADTH CAPCA webinar designed to describe the proposed transition of CAPCA's Cancer Drug Implementation Advisory Committee into CADTH. On behalf of all of us here who are presenting and CADTH and CAPCA, welcome to the call. So you would have received, to be here today, you would have received notification on February 21st through the Pharmaceutical Review Update process that we were hosting this webinar and launching a consultation on this proposed transition. So our purpose today is to actually review the proposal. You will have received, and I'm sure have read from cover to cover, the background document and have seen the accompanying survey to go with the consultation. It opened on the 28th of February and it closes on the 28th of March. Our purpose today is to review the proposed transition, the process, and to answer any questions you have. We have 1 hour together, during which we expect to present for approximately 35 to 40 minutes, and then we will leave it open for questions. I will explain in a few slides how you can submit questions to the presenters. So on today's agenda includes 5 components. The first 2 are for anybody who may be on the call who isn't familiar with the Canadian Association of Provincial Cancer Agencies Cancer Drug Implementation Advisory Committee, which we'll refer to from this point forward as CDIAC. You'll have a couple of slides to describe the history and an evaluation of that work. There also will be a brief description of the current process to coordinate the work of PCODR and CDIAC, as both of those as background. The meat of the presentation today is about the actual proposed revisions to the PCODR process to integrate key functions from CDIAC. We will describe then some of the immediate next steps, so you know what the timeline is, and following that, we'll open it up for about 20 to 25 minutes of questions. That's our agenda for today. Your speakers, my name is Heather Logan. I'm the Senior Advisor in the Pharmaceutical Review Directorate here at CADTH, and I'm going to be your moderator today. I may also take liberty and answer or start to answer some of the questions, although the real detail will come from one of the other speakers today, who I'm sure you all know very well. After my slides, Erika Brown, who's the Interim Executive Director of CAPCA, will provide the history and evaluation of CDIAC and describe a little bit of that coordination between CDIAC and PCODR. Alex Chambers, who you probably know very, very well, is the director of PCODR, will then walk you through the proposed revisions to the process at PCODR, and I will then wrap up with the timeline and next steps. So in terms of webinar logistics, as you heard when you joined the call, this call is being recorded. We will be posting the actual webinar with a full voice and presentation on CADTH's website, likely very early next week. So if you'd like to come back and listen to it again, you should feel free to do that. Because of the number of people who are on the call today, we have well over 200 people and probably multiple people in some rooms, so well over 200. The lines have been muted, so we have a clear line to present and to have responses to your questions. In order for you to submit questions, which we warmly welcome, please submit them through the question box. And if you look on your webinar tool on the right-hand side, you'll see this box, which I've highlighted in red, a box around it. This is where you submit your questions. These will be grouped. Often I find when we do webinars, we have similar kinds of questions. So you may not hear your question repeated verbatim. It may be an amalgam of 2 or 3 similar questions. Your identity as a submitter will not be divulged to anybody on this line, so you can see your questions, but you cannot see anybody else's. All of the CADTH staff who are participating and the presenters are able to see the questions that are submitted in order for them to be able to respond to them. We will also have a full summary of the questions that have been submitted in the recording feature that we get after the fact, and that will identify you. So if you have any concerns with that, you can feel free to reach out to me directly and we can look for a solution. And finally, this webinar today and our ongoing discussion with stakeholders with you signifies that this is a proposal. Certainly we have given it a lot of thought and have had a number of conversations internally and with our advisory and expert groups, but it is a proposal. This is a true consultation. We will be revising the proposal based on the kind of feedback that we get and our ability to meet our timelines. So ministries of health, cancer agencies, clinicians, the pharmaceutical sector, and most importantly, patients and patient groups should feel free to submit. We strongly encourage you to do that by March 28th. Just waiting for the next slide to advance. Okay, so I'm going to hand it over now to Erika Brown, who's the Interim Executive Director at CAPCA, for the history and evaluation. Erika?
Thank you, Heather. For those of you who don't know, CAPCA is an interprovincial organization of provincially designated cancer programs. We work with national and provincial partners to identify and address common challenges and ultimately strengthen the delivery of cancer care in Canada. Advances in our understanding of how to treat cancer drugs is expanding rapidly, and the number of new and expensive oncology drugs is mounting. With this, the number of Canadians with cancer is also rising, and many require treatment for longer periods of time. In 2016, CAPCA launched the Cancer Drug Funding Sustainability Initiative in response to an urgent need identified by the provinces to address these challenges. The overall goal is to ensure Canadian patients continue to have access to new and effective cancer treatments while supporting our cancer system in achieving maximum value for the money invested. CAPCA's work builds on existing drug evaluation by CADTH, PCODR, and NS, and price negotiation by the PCPA. CDIAC work starts once an initial recommendation is released by the PCODR Expert Review Committee and culminates with a set of recommendations presented to the CAPCA board to consider. This work is typically done within 90 days to ensure board-endorsed recommendations are shared with PCPA before the start of negotiations. CDIAC is a multidisciplinary expert committee convened and chaired by a member of the CAPCA board. Its role is to help identify and provide advice on how new drugs can be integrated into existing funding pathways. Through this work, we can achieve greater consistency in funding decisions across the country. We are able to consider affordability and budget impact so that we can better understand the implications of different funding options. For example, if there's significant chair time required for delivering a therapy, or if there are issues related to dosing that need to be considered, CDIAC identifies those issues, discusses, and then makes recommendations to the CAPCA board. Expert clinician input is considered as part of this process. Depending on the complexity or number of issues requiring clinician input, CDIAC seeks feedback either through a survey or by convening an ad hoc clinician advisory panel. Panel members, if needed, are appointed by the CAPCA Board of Directors. CDIAC advice is reviewed by the CAPCA Board and, if approved, is shared with provincial oncology pharmacy leads, ministries of health, and to PCPA, ideally, as I mentioned earlier, before the start of negotiations. We do know through a recent review that our work is giving clinicians a stronger voice in how drugs are implemented, and CDIAC recommendations are supporting increased consistency across provincial oncology drug listings, and that it is doing so without unnecessarily delaying patient access.
Okay, so this is Alex Chambers. I'm going to take the next few minutes and walk us through the proposal. So, but before I do that, I just wanted just to take a moment and recognize that a lot of the impetus for making this change to have the functions of CDIAC integrated into the PCODR process was based on what we've heard from our stakeholders, including patients and patient groups, clinicians, and industry. So we're very much looking forward to hearing your feedback that you have on the proposal that we've put forward. So again, this first slide is really just to take a minute to walk you through the steps of the existing processes. So there are 4 key steps that we have within the process with both PCODR and CDIAC that I'm going to initially just walk you through and then speak to where the proposed changes will occur. So in the first step, so the pre-submission phase, it's the 4-month phase that we have, where we have a number of planning activities for allocating resources, obtaining input from the Provincial Advisory Group, or PAG, and also that's where we hold the pre-submission meeting with the submitter to have a preliminary understanding of the submission and the drug that we're going to be looking at. About a month before the submission comes in is when we have a call for input from our stakeholders, so for our patients and patient groups and the clinicians. Then the next step in the process is the actual assessment. So this is where we're doing the review. This is the 180 days that we have to do the review with our review team and ultimately getting the reports, both the clinical and economic reports, to our expert review committee, or PERC, so the PCODR expert review committee, where they make a recommendation on the drug under review. After that, we'll post the initial recommendation and it'll go up for feedback. So that's the third step. So this third step where we do a call for feedback from our stakeholders. So from the patients and clinicians who have provided input up front, from PAG, and the submitter also has a chance at that time to provide feedback on that recommendation. The feedback's considered again by PERC, and then a final recommendation is posted on the CADTH website. So during that period of right before the initial recommendation, so about a month before the initial recommendation is issued, that's where step 4 fits in and where CDIAC work picks up, and where they're looking at the algorithm. And so they take about 4 months to look at the algorithm and then have the board endorse the algorithm after the notification to implement. So in terms of the proposal, there are a few key aspects that I'm going to walk through today. So the first of which is the introduction of an algorithm. And the intent of the algorithm is to outline the currently funded publicly funded landscape in Canada. And for an example, you can look in the background document that was part of the consultation in Appendix A, just to give you a sense of what we think this might look like. Also, as part of the proposal, there'd be an enhancement to the clinician and patient group input that we receive. And then there would also be some proposed changes to the terms of reference to PERC, the PCODR Expert Review Committee, PAG, the Provincial Advisory Group, and the Clinical Guidance Panel. And just a reminder that the Clinical Guidance Panel is the group of expert clinicians that are recruited for each submission to provide interpretation of the evidence and the clinical context in Canada. And then the final part of the proposal is to look at embedding the CAPCA board's endorsement of the algorithm into the process. So now we're just going to walk through a few of the steps for each of the steps of the proposal through the steps of the process. So looking at the pre-submission phase first, and I will say that just for some clarity, you're going to see some blue circles and some green circles. So just so you know, the blue circles are for modified changes to the existing process, and the green circles are to new things that would be added as part of this proposal. So looking at the pre-submission phase, as you can see, there are 4 proposed changes here. So the first being the development of a provisional algorithm. So this would be developed by CADTH staff, and we would heavily rely on PAG to validate the algorithm that would be developed. We would rely as well on existing CAPCA algorithms, and then if there is not an existing algorithm, we would develop our own. We are also proposing to have a mandatory 120-day pre-submission notification period. As many of you will know, we already ask for 120 days of pre-notification, and by far, most of our submissions are in industry are meeting this timeline. I believe it's about 94% of our submissions come in within that timeline, and by making it mandatory, it will just help us facilitate the workflow and the workload planning in this period, because there is quite a bit that we are suggesting that would happen in this 4-month time frame. The third item would be to have a consistent order of when we're gathering the PAG input and the pre-submission and having the pre-submission meeting with industry. So the PAG input would come first, and that way that would allow us to have a conversation with industry at the pre-submission meeting about the provisional algorithm. And this is actually something we've heard quite a bit from industry in the past, that they would like to hear about the implementation issues that PAG may have more up front. And I think the conversation of the provisional algorithm at this phase, I think, would facilitate those discussions even further. And then the final item on this in this pre-submission phase would be looking at the registered clinician and patient input template, and we can seek input about specific issues related to that provisional algorithm from clinicians and patients. So going to the next step. And so this is through the assessment process. So this is the actual review period. So as I mentioned on the previous slide, blue indicates that is a modified process and green is new. So you'll see there are a few new items that would occur within that 180-day review period. So we would ask for clinician input through ad hoc clinical panels or an online survey for drugs where we anticipate more complexity in a therapeutic area. And we would also ask for the clinical guidance panel to review and provide comments on that provisional algorithm. You'll notice as well that we have something called a PAG checkback on this proposal as well, and that gives us an opportunity to go back to PAG and make sure that their implementation issues that they've flagged up front are actually being addressed through the provisional algorithm that has been developed. At the time that the materials are sent to the PERC Expert Review Committee, we would also be sending what we're calling a PAG bundle, or what is that algorithm and the summary of clinician input to the CAPCA Board of Directors to give them an opportunity to review that information as well. And then PERC would make a recommendation, and PERC would do as they normally have and look using their deliberative framework to make a recommendation. However, they would also comment on the provisional algorithm. I'm going to the next slide. There we go. And then we've got the last step in the process, and this is where we're seeking feedback and then the completion of the recommendation. So as many of you know, and as I've already mentioned, when PERC makes an initial recommendation, it is posted on our website. What we have proposed in this process is that the algorithm and the summary of the clinical feedback would also be included in that initial recommendation, which would then be open for feedback to those stakeholders who had participated at the start of the review. So for patient groups who had participated and clinicians as well, the submitter would have an opportunity to provide feedback as well as PAG. And then once the feedback had been reviewed by the Expert Review Committee or by PERC, the final recommendation would be issued as per our usual process. However, in this case, the final recommendation would also include the algorithm as well as a clinical summary. So going to the next slide. This is just now an overview of the proposed process altogether with all three steps included. So the pre-submission, the period, the assessment period itself, and then the feedback and completion stage. And I think what's important to note at this point is that we anticipate no change in the timeline at any phase of the review. And then the idea would be to embed the functions of CDIAC into our existing timelines. So if we go to the next slide, talking a little bit here more about the PAG enhancements. So again, PAG being the Provincial Advisory Group. So there would be a bit of a change in where PAG would take an ownership of the process to develop and finalize the draft algorithm. They would help in the identification of the clinicians who would participate in the ad hoc surveys and be part of the panels as well. And then they would act as a bridge to ministry and the cancer agencies. In terms of membership, there's a proposal to expand the membership to include some physician systemic therapy leaders to assist with the interpretation of the clinical feedback. If we can go to the next slide. And so in terms of the role of PERC, so the Expert Review Committee, they would have the PAG bundle. So again, the PAG bundle being the algorithm and summary of the clinical input. They would have that in addition to what they would normally receive for their deliberations. They would be asked specifically to comment on the reasonableness of the draft algorithm and to comment and reflect on those discussions within the draft algorithm from their perspective. But there would be no changes in the membership of PERC. And to the next slide. So just in summary, you can see that there are many parts of the PCODR process that would remain the same. And as I've mentioned already, the assessment for performance targets, so that 180 days would remain the same, and so no changes there. And so there's many things that would just remain as per the typical PCODR review. In terms of what would be modified, you can see on the list here. So the pre-submission, pre-notification period would become mandatory at 120 days. The possibility to expand the patient and clinician input to ask specific questions related to the algorithm. Looking at CGP and PERC to comment on the reasonableness of the funding or the algorithm, and to look at the PAG mandate and composition. So looking to expand PAG's role and the composition. And then finally, when the initial recommendation and final recommendation and the feedback there, to include the algorithm in those documents as well. What is entirely new would be the point where PAG sort of mid-review could have a check back and to make sure that we were on track and meeting their implementation needs. The CAPCA board engagement would also be new, and then the addition of the ad hoc clinical surveys and the clinical panels would be new. So I'm going to stop there and hand it back to Heather for some final comments.
Great, thank you very much, Alex. So next slide, please. In the timeline, so I mentioned at the very beginning of the webinar that the consultation was announced on February 21st, and the reason for that was to give you as much time as we could in a fairly compressed timeline to register for the webinar and to read through. No background document is coming so that you could come prepared to answer questions to facilitate your internal discussions. If you click again, sorry, I did animate these slides, and this is the one that seemed to have retained the animation. Secondly, the consultation background and survey was released on February the 28th. So you should have access to that if you haven't yet read that. Hopefully now hearing the webinar and going back to those documents to reflect on how best to provide advice, it will be more complete in your minds and helpful. The webinar, of course, today. After today, we hope on Monday, March 11th, this webinar will be posted again so you can come back and refer to it and look at the slides again. The consultation will actually close on March the 28th, so your submissions are due through this online survey by March 28th. After that, of course, there will be a period of internal reflection and review of the feedback that we've received with our staff, with the advisory mechanisms that we have in place, including PAG and PAC, our expert review committee, PERC, plus any external discussion that needs to take place with CAPCA and others to determine the magnitude of the proposed changes and what impact that may have on the proposal and our timeline. The proposal will be modified and all of our process documentation will be revised in the periods of May to about June. And this, of course, assumes that we haven't heard such significant feedback that will require an adjustment of the proposal in a major way and or an extension of our timeline. Finally, we expect or are driving towards launching this embedded work on July 1st of 2019. So it is a fairly ambitious timeline. Your feedback will help us move through that. Finally, just again in terms of questions, we realize this is a lot of information to take in, and that after you get off this call, you may have questions. We hope we can use this opportunity to answer some of them that are top of mind. So please, again, as a reminder, you can send your questions through the question box, and you can start to do that now. They will be grouped again, likely to facilitate the panel's response. The questions, again, to remind you of your questions, will not be visible to anybody but you, except we will see them at the CADTH level, and they will be retained with the file that we receive internally from the webinar. So having said that, then, that would be the end of the formal part of the presentation, and we've actually left more time for questions than we had thought. We have about 33 minutes left. So before we start, I'm just waiting for the first question to come in, and obviously this is a webinar for you, designed for you, so if you have no questions, then we will just anxiously await your responses to the questionnaire. Okay, so I see that some have come in. I wonder if we can start off and just talk, Erika, I wonder if you can talk a little bit about what CAPCA endorsement of an algorithm means, just as part of the background.
Sure, thank you, Heather. First of all, because the CAPCA board is comprised of the most senior leaders from each provincial cancer program, giving them an opportunity to review and endorse recommendations that impact their program and how they may implement the new therapies is something that we did think was important to sustain as this gets moved into CADTH. So currently, CDIAC serves as an advisory body to the CAPCA board. CDIAC prepares recommendations on implementation and a provisional algorithm by considering several different inputs that I had mentioned earlier and that Alex has mentioned in the webinar. That includes the PCODR recommendation, available evidence, and provincial pharmacy and clinician input, which is then all culminated into a briefing note that includes the recommendations and submitted to the CAPCA board for approval. So post-transition, we view this as being much the same. So PAG will assemble the PAG bundle using similar inputs that are used right now by CDIAC, and then send that to the CAPCA board to consider. The CAPCA board will then review the bundle with the following elements to consider. So one, do the recommendations and provisional algorithm reflect current provincial practice? Are the recommendations feasible to implement? And do they support sustainability? And giving CAPCA the opportunity to recommend provincial representatives early in that process through the ad hoc panels that are being proposed in this new model will give them assurances that the final PAG bundle reflects current practice and perspectives of their respective provinces. Heather, do you have an additional response that you'd like to add to that as well, and what it will look like after the transition is complete? You may be muted.
My apologies, I was not on. We will follow very similar processes and guidelines that are currently instituted by CAPCA through CDIAC, and I will reinforce that the algorithm in a recommendation does not in any way constitute agreement by either the cancer program or by the Ministry of Health to automatically fund that drug. It is a recommendation based on best advice that we've been able to gather and summarize through the process. Jurisdictions, as always, remain independent in their ability to make those funding decisions. We do hope, however, that by engaging the clinical leads who represent tumor groups across the country, by engaging with practicing clinicians in a discussion about the algorithm, by taking it through PAG and by PERC, that we are giving the jurisdictions the best possible advice about the implementation of these new therapies. I'll move to another question that's come in through the online question forum, and I'm going to ask Alex if she can answer it, and it relates to whether what conversations might have taken place with INESS to determine if there's an ability to align, or at least to be assured that we're, what might be the perspective of our ability to work with INESS, just to make sure they're aware of these plans.
Thanks, Heather. So INESS has been engaged through the process and through the discussions, and we walked them through a couple of weeks ago the proposed transition, and they are they are supportive, and we continue to work with them to make sure that they are engaged as we move ahead with this, because we do know that they are involved with CAPCA right now, and we want to definitely support that.
Great, thank you. I think you did touch on this in the presentation, Alex, but I wonder if you could just draw out anything that's specific around the level of stakeholder engagement in the process. So there is a process certainly within CDIAC now to engage patient, family, and public representative. I wonder if you can just talk about how this proposal embeds the ability for different stakeholders to provide feedback.
Thank you. So I can definitely speak to that. So as many of you will know, we do have a number of opportunities through the existing PCODR process for stakeholders to participate. So in particular, we're going to talk specifically about patients, where we have an opportunity for patients to participate, to provide their input right up front during that pending period where we ask for input from patient groups. We also have the opportunity at the PERC meeting where we do have patients involved on the committee and who are involved in the deliberations and the voting. And then there is the opportunity for the feedback at the end after the recommendation has been posted. So that's for patients, that's how they are engaged throughout the process. And we also, again, similarly engage clinicians throughout the process as well. We have, as you know, the modified process that we modified last summer to have clinicians provide input to tailored questions through registered clinician impact or input. We also have the clinical guidance panel, which is unique for each review, and the clinicians are chosen because of their expertise in a specific disease area. And then again, clinicians on PERC as well. May I add, I'm actually just looking at the questions, and I see there's actually a question that's come up from a number of you regarding when industry will have a chance to look at the algorithm, and I thought I might just take an opportunity. I should have mentioned it in my presentation, and I did not. So I'll take an opportunity now to speak to that. There will be an opportunity at the pre-submission meeting to see the provisional algorithm, and that is part of the reason why we will have PAG's input before the pre-submission meeting will occur, so that when we have the pre-submission meeting, we can take that algorithm to the pre-submission meeting with the industry so that they can see it at that time. There may also be, and this is we're still in discussion, but there may also be an opportunity to have a subsequent look at the algorithm at the checkpoint meeting as well, and that's still in discussion.
Thank you, Alex. Just to give Alex a little bit of a break, she is definitely the point person for this proposal, but she's been working with the team, and so I'm going to respond to one of the questions that has come in as part of the discussion that we've had internally, and then give her a chance to kind of look through some of the questions and see if there's another one she'd like to answer right away. One of the questions that has come in is what level of clinician would be involved in helping to provide advice on that algorithm, and I'm assuming that refers to the ad hoc clinical panel or the online survey. So I will reassure listeners that these would be individuals who would either be tumor group leads, so they are experts in both treating the disease and the indication specific to that drug that's being reviewed for a funding algorithm. If it isn't the tumor group lead because it is such a highly specific indication, then we would work with the Canadian Association of Provincial Cancer Agencies, in particular with each of the CEOs of those cancer programs, to find the expert that is most familiar with both the disease, the indication, and the drug being reviewed. So these would not be general clinicians. These would be experts who treat this disease and understand the indication. Just to build on that, in terms of the PAG membership, we are proposing that we include a number of systemic therapy leaders. So we are again proposing as part of that augmentation that they would be the individuals that would chair the clinical panels. So they may not have the direct experience treating this indication or using this drug, but the panel itself will. So that hopefully will answer that question. And I'm just going to turn to Alex and to see if another question has popped up that she feels we can answer.
So, first of all, thank you. There are a lot of questions coming in. And again, as Heather had mentioned, it's just trying to group everything together. So there have been a couple of questions about the pre-submission meeting and how that will work. As you have noted in the questions, that as PCODR is currently set up, we allow one pre-submission meeting every 6 months. You're correct. We'll have to look at how that we've got this set up in order to allow for that discussion for each file on at the pre-submission meeting. So that's definitely something we have to take back and figure out how that will work. But that's definitely something that's on our radar. And then there was another question regarding whether the checkpoint meeting would still continue. And yes, the intent is to still continue to have a checkpoint meeting midpoint through the review.
Thank you. So I'm going to ask Erika to answer the next question. So as many of you know, CDIAC and CAPCA's Cancer Drug Funding Sustainability Initiative started in 2016, and it is now a process and an outcome that clinicians and decision makers are relying on, including at the PCPA table. So Erika, I wonder if I could ask you to speak about what the transition of these key functions to CADTH means for CAPCA's Drug Funding Sustainability Initiative and for CDIAC on a go forward. Will there be any pieces of the work that will be retained? And if there are, what do you envision they will be?
Thank you, Heather. So as you know, CAPCA played a lead role in establishing this work initially and getting it up and running. But the plan had always been to, if this sort of feasibility process was effective, to transition this to an organization that was better able to sustain the work. But in doing so, we did know that there were elements that would need to continue to have sort of active work undertaken by CAPCA. And I do think that the proposed transition model that was presented today highlights areas that CAPCA board will continue to be engaged through your process. But there are things that CAPCA will need to sort of maintain in-house. And we think about things that are more administrative in nature. So things that I had mentioned earlier in one of the earlier slides around chair times or staffing, resourcing, and things that are much more of an administrative rather than a therapeutic nature would continue to be led by CAPCA. And what we're looking at is developing some sort of standing committee that will allow us to maintain an active role in those administrative pieces, but also feed into the PAG Plus model that's being presented here.
Thank you very much, Erika. And I'm just looking at Alex, and I know she's got a question that she'd like to try and answer.
Yes, thanks. Thanks, Heather. So there's been a couple questions coming in on how the algorithm will be developed initially, which is a great question. And so what we will rely on initially is what is publicly funded in the Canadian system, and then that's what we'll build upon and look for the evidence to inform that, and where we will look to the clinicians to help guide us where there are some gaps in evidence, so that can inform decision makers as they're trying to make decisions. On a related question, there's a question regarding what are the considerations when looking at a comparator, and this is something that I know has come up a number of times, trying to determine what is the most relevant comparator within the Canadian landscape, recognizing that when clinical trials are developed, the landscape can change fairly quickly, and so that by the time a trial is completed, the comparator they used in the trial may not be the most relevant in the Canadian context anymore. And so we're really looking to you as we're going through this consultation to help us think about what we could rely on consistently as a relevant comparator and where it sits within the landscape. And so trying to understand what is currently funded, and is that a relevant comparator, or is it even looking even a little further upstream to see what could potentially be funded, what has a PERC recommendation or what is undergoing review within PCODR at this time. And so we're really looking to hear from you in terms of what we could use as a basis for defining a relevant comparator.
Thank you. Erika, I'd just like to give you an opportunity. Is there anything in the last few questions from a CAPCA perspective that you wanted to reinforce or circle back on?
I think there was quite a few questions around how we currently develop a funding algorithm that will be called a provisional algorithm once it's transitioned, and the input that we get. So currently, what CAPCA does is we use a medical oncologist and a senior pharmacy lead to develop the funding algorithm. If CDIAC identifies the need to get clinician input either through a survey or through an ad hoc panel, then that is either level of engagement is done through one representative, typically a lead within the tumor group from each province, and that's identified through the CAPCA board. So what that would mean is it's not a broad clinical or clinician input that's sought, but one response from or input from each province, and that would go to refining the algorithm that is then considered and re-refined at a granular level by CDIAC members before it is shared with the CAPCA board. Also understanding that there are opportunities where there's a number of therapies that are coming into a specific disease space. So the intent of these algorithms is not that they become static, but that they're evolving as the disease space is evolving. And so those can and often do get re-reviewed on a frequent basis as new therapies come up.
Thank you, Erika. There are a number of questions. I just want to acknowledge them, although we are not in a position to answer them because we're from CADTH, and the questions relate to what impact these algorithms have had or will have going forward on PCPA negotiation processes. So I just want to acknowledge that there are a number of questions that have been raised. Sang Mi from the PCPA office is on the line. Like you, though, she's muted and not able to respond to that question, so we will flag those and draw those to the attention of PCPA. I can say that we have had conversations with the PCPA office as well as with INEST to make sure that they've had an opportunity to comment on and to help shape the proposal, and have been reassured by the PCPA office that this process of seeking input earlier and having an algorithm ready at the end of the recommendation is something that would support PCPA negotiations. But I will flag the questions and raise them with the PCP office directly. Alex, did you want to take the next question?
Sure, and maybe I'll just tag on to something you just said, Heather. There have been a couple questions about how the economics will fit into this, and I think that also sort of remains to be seen, and I think that's something that we'll have to take back and look and see how that will look moving forward. I've noticed a couple of questions coming in about whether we're going to do this as a pilot or whether we're going to go ahead with this. And I can let Erika and Heather speak to this, but we are going to proceed with this and moving the functions of CDIAC within to CADTH. We will commit to evaluating the process that is implemented, but it does need to move from CAPCA into CADTH, and I'll let Heather.
Thanks, Alex. I'll just offer a few comments and then Erika ask if you'd like to add any in addition. So the process of transitioning this work into CADTH was initially, even in 2016, was at the request of the CAPCA Board of Directors, recognizing that our stakeholders at CADTH understand our process. It is transparent. There are multiple opportunities for input by stakeholders, and given CAPCA's resources, many of those opportunities just weren't feasible given resourcing levels in the organization. So there has been an ongoing request for CADTH to take this work on so that we can be more transparent and so that we can seek and incorporate stakeholder input into the process. And we think that the proposal reflects both of those commitments. By changing the clinician and patient questionnaire template at the beginning to ask questions that are specific to the algorithm to inform discussions along the process, and to also then show that provisional algorithm at the end of the process along with a summary of the clinical feedback that we've received, so you can see what we've heard, and that you can use that to help shape the kind of feedback you provide to us about those algorithms. So with those comments, I'll ask Erika, did you want to supplement in any way?
No, that sounds good. Thank you, Heather.
Okay, so I guess one of the other questions that we're seeing frequently in the question box is, whether all drugs will have to go through this process within PCODR. And I'm wondering if you wanted to give a general comment about, our early thinking at this point about those decisions.
So I think it's definitely something that's come up here as well, looking at, what the extent to which each drug will require having either a panel or a survey. I think we'll look and see from CAPCA's experience and what the process that they've put in place. We also are lucky in that CDR has recently also been looking at having ad hoc clinician panels, and I think we'll also lean on them for their experience and looking at when they're having these panels and what sort of scenarios sort of warrant having the broader clinical panel versus the survey.
I'm just going to pause for a minute and see if there are many of the questions that have come in that we haven't yet answered either require a fairly long answer, and so we might deal with offline. I'm just going to scroll to the bottom and see if there are any that we haven't addressed that maybe we could.
And this is Alex again. So maybe while Heather is doing that, there was a comment regarding whether there will be feedback coming back out of the consultation. So a summary of all of the consultation and feedback received, and we can commit to providing a summary of the feedback that we hear from all of the stakeholders that everyone will be able to see after the consultation period has ended.
So I guess one of the other questions that has come in is, when does this actually start? So are the drugs that are currently going through the review process be subject to this, or is the start point July 1st for new submissions after that point? I wonder if you could just clarify that, Alex.
So it's so yes, thanks for that. So it is on a go forward basis. So I know CDIAC still continues to work on their ongoing files, and there will be a transition plan put in place, but it is on an going forward basis after July 1st.
So I'm going to read one of the questions out. It's come from one of our PAG members. By draft algorithm at the beginning, do we mean what's currently being funded, so we can ask targeted questions to patients, clinicians, and industry to inform the discussions about the algorithm, both at PAG, through the ad hoc clinical panel, and then at PERC, so that we'll all see the integrated file and the draft algorithm at the time of the initial recommendation. So I wonder if you can just speak, Alex, to, it's a fairly comprehensive process with multiple inputs. How does the end user see that? How will that look at the end? Will it be part of the recommendation, and how much documentation do you envision?
So the intent is that we will have one document that would include the recommendation coming out of PERC, and then having also within that document having the algorithm as well, and with being quite clear as to what is based on evidence and where we have evidence to inform that, and then where there are the gaps in evidence, yet still there needs to be common information provided. And I think, but the intent would be to have one common document for everyone to be able to rely on.
Thanks, Alex. One of the other questions that's come in, and I'm going to ask Alex if she'd like to supplement, and perhaps Erika if she can comment on the current process. The question is that we had mentioned in the presentation that PAG members would identify physicians to provide input through an ad hoc panel or an online survey. And just to be clear specifically, the difference between the panel and a survey. For an ad hoc panel, we would go to the CAPCA Board of Directors and ask individual CEOs to nominate the clinician expert that they would like to sit on that panel. And those individuals would both be treating clinicians who have an deep understanding of that indication and an awareness of the drug, as well as being involved in some of the discussions around allocation, systemic therapy for the province as a whole. An online survey would still be clinicians who have a deep understanding of the disease, but the questions that we ask them would be a little bit more straightforward than we might have to go to an ad hoc panel for. The board would identify, individual board members would identify ad hoc panel members, and online survey members would be identified by our PAG representatives from the ministry and or from the agency across the country. So just to clarify that, and I wonder if you could comment a little bit, Alex and Erika, on the current process for doing that, and why PAG to identify online survey members. Is this something that we currently do, the kind of discussion that we're currently having with PAG? Erika, would you like to respond to that first, and then I can ask Alex to add?
Sure. So honestly, sometimes it comes down to a bandwidth issue at CDIAC. So we flag therapies for survey much more frequently than an ad hoc panel. And so we do find it efficient to go to CDIAC members to ask them to identify an individual to respond from their province, a clinical lead to respond to the surveys on their province. And then that CDIAC member can be responsible for looping back to make sure that they get a response from within their province. And that's just more efficient than seeking CAPCA board member endorsement or to identify somebody. Also, because the ad hoc panels require a little bit more work, it's important from our perspective that the most senior person responsible for the program understands that we are asking for part of their staff members' time to participate in this, and by looping the board member indirectly, we're de facto getting their endorsement to seek their time.
Thanks, Erika. So maybe I can comment a little bit on how we're working with clinicians within the PCODR process right now, and how I think it will match up nicely with what Erika has described. So as I'd mentioned, we do have our clinical guidance panels. So again, 3 to 5 expert clinicians that are being recruited for each review that we do, and they are there to provide interpretation and guidance, looking at the clinical evidence, but also providing their sort of their clinical lens from the Canadian perspective. So we have those clinicians that we work with, and again, they may have a somewhat different perspective based on where they sit within the system. But I think that will help as we move through the process and looking at the algorithm, and keeping in mind that the clinicians who provide input as registered clinicians will also have an opportunity to see that algorithm as well. So there will be a number of different opportunities for clinicians who wear different hats and sort of sit in different spaces within the system to be able to look at the algorithm and provide feedback.
Thank you, Alex. I know that we've got about 8 minutes left in the webinar. There are some questions, so I just want to acknowledge there are a number of questions that have come in that we have not either I haven't asked, and so therefore haven't been answered. They are all tracked. Some of them actually require that we go back and actually have some more discussions internally. As I said at the beginning, this is a consultation, and we do not have every single answer locked down yet. So if you've submitted a question and we haven't answered it, that's the likely reason. And given the nature of those questions, I'm just going to go around first and ask Erika and then Alex if there's anything that they would like to summarize, or a last question that they'd like to respond to reinforce the proposal or the approach that's being presented. Erika first.
I don't at this point. Thank you, Heather.
Okay, Alex?
So I guess maybe I'd just like to reiterate what I sort of mentioned earlier, and just highlighting that a lot of this work and of transferring the functions from CAPCA and CDIAC into CADTH really is based on what we've heard from our stakeholders, looking to get the process more embedded within PCODR. And so again, hoping to hear from you, and looking forward to receiving your feedback on the consultation.
Thank you very much, Alex. So I know we will be ending the webinar a few minutes early. I'll just thank you very much for your time, and again review our next steps. So this webinar will be posted early next week, so you can come back and reflect on it. We close the survey, so the online consultation will close on March the 28th. So please do submit your feedback to us through the online survey tool. We will then be taking the time in April to talk to our with our staff internally as well as our advisory and expert groups to summarize the feedback that we've heard, and we'll be working with CAPCA and to think about changes to the proposal and our timeline. And then we will be working towards changing our processes and our documentation in May and June with a launch of July. We will be sharing documentation with participants on the call in a general way to answer as many questions as possible that have been raised today, and some of that will be through a revision of the process documentation. So there may not be just specifically a Q&A document that is circulated, but there will be documentation that we will hopefully will answer as many of your questions as possible. So with that, I will thank Erika and Alex for the time and energy and the teams that were involved in putting the proposal together, for their background work, for our commitment together to transparency and input, and thank all of you in advance for the time and thoughtful comments that we're anxious to receive. Thank you and have a good day.